I'm so glad to be here. This is really a fun thing for me to be able to do, and appreciate the invitation to speak with each of you. So I know on the notice there was a whole list of labor and employment topics that we could talk about. So of course you can ask anything you want, and I'll answer your question, or I'll say, I know a guy who can answer that question. Give me your number and I'll call you later. So, but a little bit about me. My name's Trent, as you said, and I'm one of Littler's core team members. We call it the Outbound International Group, and I focus on international employment issues. So what I spend most of my day doing is dealing with the global workforce. If I have employees in China, and I have employees in the US, and I have employees in Argentina, what do I do to manage all those different rules, all those different obligations? So that's what Juan and I do, in addition to counseling on US specific matters. And I can tell you, I grew up, half of my growing up was actually in Asia, not China. I wish, because then maybe I'd speak Chinese. So I have found that my practice actually has really focused on the Asia area. And I do a lot of work with Chinese companies, Japanese companies, and Korean companies. Unfortunately, my Korean language skills will be very useless in this crowd. But that's why I rely on Juan. In case I have someone who wants to speak Chinese, I say, I know a guy. It's Juan.
Happy to translate.
That's right. So please, if you do have questions anytime, and if you want to ask in Chinese, you can ask in Chinese. If you want to ask in English, you can ask in English. I'm going to talk in English. So thank you for that. Now, we get the privilege today of talking about a really happy topic: natural disasters and violence in the workplace. So this is an optimistic and cheerful discussion. I will say, just as a disclaimer, I wouldn't be much of a lawyer if I didn't give my disclaimers. So first is, what we're telling you is not legal advice. It's a training session. So if it was legal advice, I would probably meet and then I would ask a lot of detailed questions. So today's job is to give you just sort of a high level. And if you have a question, certainly ask. Or if you're sort of embarrassed and you want to say, my friend had this problem happen, then we can answer that too. But just wanted to make that clear. And then also, we'll try to make this as light and fun as we can, given the topic. If we tell a few stories or if we have some jokes, please don't think that we think this is not a serious topic. It is a serious topic, and we do take these issues very seriously. But if you had to sit here for an hour and have us say a lot of terrible stories, it would be a very long hour. So there's that as well. Littler Mendelsohn, so that you know, we're the largest labor and employment law firm. We're a niche firm, so we only do labor and employment human resource issues. We have about 1,200 attorneys. We have about 75 offices across the globe. So we have a lot of experience in this area. So feel free to ask whatever you want. So how many of you, first of all, because I know people in audiences like this love to participate and speak. I know that. How many of you have been affected by a natural disaster? Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah. Interesting, yeah? Anybody comfortable enough to share?
Sandy.
Sandy, were you there?
Well, we lost power for 8 days.
That was an effect. It was a total effect. Anyone else? Hurricane Sandy, that was hard. Yeah. Anyone else? Affected the whole region. Anyone else? You know my story. This is how I was 14. I was living in Tokyo. I was sitting in my math class, and I had a teacher with white hair, and he shook like this. His whole body would shake when he'd write on the board. And we were sitting there, and the walls started to go, like this big earthquake, right? So, not big, but it was an earthquake. So all of us at the same time turned around to see who was shaking our chair, because you know, you're like, get your feet off my chair. But all of us did it, and then it was like, oh my gosh, the walls are shaking, there's the noise of the building. He is writing on the board the whole time. He doesn't even notice. I think because his hands are shaking, he doesn't know that the wall's shaking. And finally, one of us was like, oh my gosh, it's an earthquake. And he was like, what? Well, you should get under your desks. Well, by then it was over, right? So I was like, well, we would be dead. But it wasn't that serious. So I only tell that story. It wasn't really a natural disaster. Most of us, fortunately, don't have to go through a real natural disaster. But as an employer, we do have to be prepared. So we've all seen what happened in Houston recently. Littler has an office in Houston, and we did close it for an entire week. As you know, the whole downtown was flooded. I spoke with one of my colleagues down there right after it happened, and she described what was a relatively common occurrence, sitting in her kitchen after work, and suddenly water started coming in through her window. And she grabbed her kids and they went up to the second floor. They had to wait while the first floor filled up with water. And by the time they got out, her cars were totally submerged, the first floor was submerged. And it was a panicked email of, I've got clients who need help, but I can't help them. Who can fill in, right? And that, at first I was like, really? You're worried about emailing me about work when you've got to get your kids out of your house? But it really is a very stressful event. So what do you do as an employer, and what are the issues that commonly come up when a natural disaster happens? So I will say, for purposes of today, I'm going to talk about 4 things that you need to know about a natural disaster. So 1 is, who gets paid? Okay. 2 is, what about leaves, like leave accommodations? We're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about military leaves. Somebody who is called up to try to help in a national disaster. And then general safety issues that we need to be aware of. So we have about an hour together, and then the second topic we're going to focus on is workplace violence, which we've been asked in particular, given the recent attacks here, some of the mass shootings we've seen in the United States. What should employers be thinking about when it comes to workplace violence? Now, I will tell you, these 2 topics alone, we've done programs that are an hour and a half in length for each one. So you're only going to get a small piece of these. But there is time afterwards, and there's time during. If you have questions, you can ask. But I do want you to know there's a lot of information here that we're covering. And but feel free to ask as you go. First question, who gets paid? Here's the situation. Flood comes in. You're the employer. Okay, we're going to talk about OSHA, which is, oh crap, we're all at work. What do I do for my employees to get out? And you call, where are you, Nick? International SOS, that's who you call, right? In the back. That's my shout out. Right, so you've got your safety issues, but the next issue is, well, what happens? We've closed our office. Who do we have to pay? And here's what happens most of the time. How many of you are familiar first with Chinese overtime laws? Standard working hours, non-standard working hours, anybody? Good, well then I won't make the comparison. Except for you, Juan, yes. I was going to say, if you did, I would show you where it was different from the U.S., but since you don't know, it doesn't matter. In the U.S., there's 2 kinds of employees, okay? There's exempt employees and there's non-exempt employees. And what that means is this, and anybody who is exempt means the law doesn't apply to people, we're talking about the overtime law. So we talk about somebody who's exempt from the overtime regulations. If somebody works more than 40 hours in a week, you have to pay an additional amount, time and a half, for every hour that they work above 40. So they get a premium rate, okay? That's your non-exempt employees. Those are the employees that you're required to give overtime to. The exempt employees, anybody heard of this before? Exempt and non-exempt? Yeah. Yeah, good. So who are the exempt employees? What kind of employees are they? Anybody comfortable enough to share? Yeah.
I guess it's people with very professional skills, such as lawyers, investment bankers, these kinds.
Yeah, so she says, I guess it's professionals like lawyers and investment bankers. Star, yes. Any other kind of employee? Yes.
Or with the managing members of the company.
Yes, absolutely right. Management members, executives and managers, professionals, and there's one other group, is the outside sales. So they're the people who are never come into the office, so it's hard for us to know how many hours they're working, and sometimes they meet clients at night, and sometimes they meet them in the day. So those are your exempt employees. The rule for this is a long sort of explanation to get to this point. The office is closed. Nobody works for a week. Do I have to pay them? That's the question that I'm answering. So, for exempt employees, the answer is, if you close for half a day, you have to still pay them. In fact, if you don't close for the whole week, you have to pay them. In other words, and I'll give you, on the other hand, if you're talking about non-exempt employees, they're paid when they work. So if they're not working and you're closed for a week and you don't ask your secretaries to come in, or you don't ask the people to work on your manufacturing line, then you don't pay them during that period of time, okay? But sometimes, because this seems logical, well, they didn't work, I don't have to pay them. It seems logical that way, but for your exempt staff, it doesn't apply. They're on a salary. The salary assumes that you pay them the same no matter how many hours, how many or how few hours they work. There are some exceptions. If you close for the entire work week, Monday through Friday, you could probably not pay the exempt employees, okay? You can, however, require the exempt employees to use vacation. So if you're closed for a week because there's a flood and you're trying to clean out the building, you could say you have to take vacation for that week because you're getting it off, even though you're at home sludging out, muck from your carpets, okay? So that's sort of the first topic, who gets paid and why. Okay, here's the other thing about exempt, non-exempt employees. Waiting time and on-call time. There's a flood. You call out everybody, don't come to the office, we're going to be closed. I don't know how long, we're waiting to see how bad the storm gets, but stand by and don't go anywhere. Do I have to pay them? Yes. If I told them to stand by and not go anywhere, that's work time for a non-exempt employee. I call my secretary, I say, you have to be ready to come to work whenever I call. Then that's on call, arguably. So be careful how you do those things. If the secretary shows up for work and you come running out and say, oh my gosh, there's a big hurricane coming, you've only been here 10 minutes, but go home. In New York, do you pay her for 10 minutes? No, you pay her for 4 hours at the minimum wage. She gets at least 4 hours of time just for showing up to work. Now, if she stays for 5 hours, you just pay her her regular 5 hours. If she's at 3 hours and 30 minutes, you pay her 4 hours in New York. Okay? So this is our first question, who gets paid? Hopefully that helps you. A couple of quick topics here. Somebody says, I got all these emails right after Harvey. Attorneys will be working from their home. Please contact them on their cell phones. So we're allowing them to work remotely. And that's fine for exempt employees. Many of us do that. Technology allows it. If you have power, you may not have power, but if you have power, you can do remote work. If it's an hourly employee, you've got to be sure you have a way to record their hours accurately, even during that time, okay? So otherwise, don't ask them to work. If they're hourly, I tend to say, don't ask them to work. But your other non-hourly people, you can. Then you get into two other issues here. Someone comes in and says, I want to volunteer to help people's houses, to help people get flood waters out of their house. Do you have anybody have a volunteer policy? Anybody heard of one? Yeah, they're not really, most people don't have one. What do you think about that? Do you give people time off to volunteer to help clean up? Anybody brave enough to say their thoughts? Yeah, so you can do whatever you want if you want to give them a volunteer position. But this is iffy because if you're putting on a shirt that says, you know, Bank of Shenzhen on it as the employer, and they walk around and help people, they're working. Okay? So if they're doing it on their own and they just call in and say, I'm not coming in today, I'm going to go help, well, that's different. But if you're coordinating it and you're sending people, be careful, you may have to pay them. All right? And then the last one is delay in wage payments, which is, I know everybody, we had this huge flood and I can't pay you on Friday, so we're just going to move the payday. We're going to delay it for 2 weeks. Well, if you're paid monthly, that's probably, might be okay. But keep in mind that statutes govern when you have to be paid. So if you really can't pay, then there's probably a good excuse. But if you are going to make a delay, you need to give people notice that you're delaying it, and you still have to keep an idea of when you have to pay. Manual workers have to be paid weekly. And it changes. Professionals here in New York, usually semi-monthly, but you can pay them on a monthly basis. Keep those frequency intervals in mind when you make a delay payment. All right? And these other things, I would say the last sort of piece on wage and hour before I move off this really fascinating topic of how you pay your people is voluntary payment. Somebody comes to you and they say, you know what, I lost both my cars in that flood. I've got to have a car to get to work. Can I get some money from you? Can you loan me money? The employer? Okay, some companies have loan policies. Or they may say, can I have an advance on my paycheck? I've got to buy essentials for my house that I lost in the earthquake. I've got to get them. But I don't have money. I need it from you. You can do this. But there's a caution. One, if you're in New York and they don't pay you back, you can probably never get it back. Okay, because there are really strict laws on deductions from wages and getting around the deduction of wage law, which means that I may say, well, I won't deduct it from your wage, but I'm going to ask you to write me a check. And that would also be considered a deduction from wage. So before you do this, talk to your lawyer because you want to be sure that you have a policy and the documents in place so that when these requests come in, you have a process that's going to protect you so you have the best chance of getting the money back in New York. Okay? Unemployment benefits, keep that out. This is something they may ask if they're fired. That kind of thing will kick in. Just know that that's there. And in Puerto Rico, we actually had a client right after the hurricane went in. They just shut the whole place down. They were like, we lost the entire plant in the fire. They lost everything, or not the fire, in the storm. They lost it all. So they closed the company in Puerto Rico. Well, one thing we had to deal with was in the U.S., if you're going to make a mass layoff like that, you still have there's notification rights in the U.S. So like in China, you have to give 30 days, or you have to give a month's notice essentially before you fire somebody. This requires notice before you fire somebody in the event of a mass layoff or a plant closure. So where they were like, just close it all down, we lost everything, we had to say, well, wait. You can't for at least 2 weeks, and you have to give the government notice, and you have to follow a bunch of different steps. So don't think that just because you lost everything, you can immediately close shop. There's some rules there. All right, this one I'm going to touch on only briefly. This is military leave, because sometimes, as you've seen, you've seen the National Guard called up, or the military jump in, and they swim around, and they get people off their out of their houses, and you saw those pictures of the lady clinging to her poodle. She left all of her clothes and all of her money, but she has her poodle, and everything else of value. And one of my friends was like, man, I was helping this guy out of Houston, and I get on my boat, he's been there for like 3 days in his house, and I'm like, take your most important thing, and fit it in my small boat. And this guy walked into his house and he came out with these 2 huge paintings. And he was like, they were the ugliest paintings I've ever seen in my life. But they had clearly some personal value to him. But at any rate, so you've seen the military people come in and do that. So here's your takeaway from this, is that U.S. law protects military people. So if somebody comes to you after Katrina, after Harvey, you don't even have an office in Texas. And they come to you and they say, I'm a member of the military, I've been asked to go to Texas. Well, you're like, you're like a manager. I can't let you go. Guess what? You have to let them go. And you have to protect their job while they're gone. And let them come back when the assignment's over. However long that is. Okay? So there are some time limits. Usually before somebody goes on a training or before they're called to active duty, you have to give them a certain number of, the employer is entitled to a certain number of weeks' notice, right? But in this case, they just have to give whatever's normal. And there are some things that you can do and some nuances here that we don't have time to go over, but the takeaway is, if somebody says they're in the military, you probably have to let them go, and you probably ought to call your attorney or HR counselor to help you walk through that. What about civilians? Keep in mind that for purposes of disaster relief, there are civilians who are part of this national disaster medical system. They're doctors, nurses, dentists, and they get called up specifically to go down and help people who are injured. And if they're called up, they're included in this protection as well. So keep that in mind. National Guard is a little bit different, but there's a nuance here where if the federal government says, I'm calling up the New York National Guard and I'm going to send them to Texas, well, USARA applies, they're protected, you have to let it go. If state governor says, New York State says, I'm calling up this state National Guard and I'm sending them to Texas, USARA would not apply. It's a federal law only, not a state law. But it doesn't matter because state law has a very similar provision. You still have to follow it. Okay? Here's OSHA. Here's the quick 2-second rule on OSHA. OSHA says, OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Act. It's our law that governs safetiness at the workplace. Okay? And essentially you have a general duty to protect your workers from imminent danger or injury. So imminent means danger that's likely to happen or that will happen very soon. So we have a general duty to protect our employees from that. And if we see a hazard, and a hazard is like a risk, like a light bulb that's electric wire that's hanging down, or maybe they're working on a machine that has a bunch of knives that cut. So you have to do certain things to protect people from those hazards. And so the same idea comes in a natural disaster. Here's your takeaway, that everybody leaves, you come to your office, it's a mud hole. There's like trash in there, the flood left all kinds of stuff on the floor. So you say to your employees, we're going to have a cleanup day. All of you have to come to the office with your brooms and your buckets. Okay? If you're going to do that, then you have certain obligations to protect them from any dangers that might be in the workplace. They will need certain equipment, they will need certain stuff to keep them safe, and you have to keep records of everything you're doing and how you're doing it. If there's an injury, you have certain reporting obligations to the government. So normally we say, don't ask your employees to do the cleanup, it's a headache, right? But it is something that they can do, and they have a right to refuse. So if they say, there's mud in there and there's like dangerous, who knows what's in that mud? It's dangerous, I don't want to go. You really, if you fire them for not coming, then we have a potential claim for retaliation. Somebody exercising a right not to work when there's a reasonable threat of danger. Now, they have to reasonably believe that there's a threat of danger, even if there isn't one. But that's something we can't just fire somebody because they didn't show up to work if there in fact is a reasonable belief for danger there, okay? National Labor Relations Act, here's how this works. This is our union laws. And you might think, there's no union at my office. I don't care about unions. Well, there's a law here that says anytime two employees work together to improve their work conditions, it's protected. They don't have to have a union. So here's what happens. You say to a group of employees, I want you to come to work right after this place and it's dangerous, and help us clean up. They may say, 3 of them may get together and say, I no, because that's not what my job is about, and I don't think you're paying me enough to scrape up mud and anything like that, and then you fire them, that could be protected under the Collective Bargaining Act. Because you were 3 people, they were talking about their job, so then there's certain processes you'd have to follow. So don't just snap judgment and fire somebody just for something like that. Okay, but here's a chart. Should help you give some idea. Often if there's an evacuation order, it changes things. So a big nor'easter is coming up the coast of New York. You get an evacuation order that says everybody needs to leave New York City. Okay, the evacuation order would govern in a situation like this. So that's where you see this. Most of the time, if you have an evacuation order, you can't do anything to your employees. They're going to follow whatever the evacuation order is. They're not going to be there to work. Okay, so you can't fire them. But if there is no evacuation order, you'll see on this side, you have a lot more flexibility. If they want to clean them up, yeah, please.
Where should the order come from?
It will come either from the federal or the state or the mayor. You'll see a bit there, usually in the news will come out and they'll say evacuation order by, the mayor or by the governor. You'll see it out on the news. And then they'll post it in a lot of places. And that's how you'll know what the rules are. So here's that, so you'll see this. Do I have to let somebody clean the floodwaters out of their house without an evacuation order? Can I fire them? Essentially, can I discipline them if they say, I'm not coming into work today because I'm cleaning mud out of my house? Well, you can do discipline in that case. So you'll see that's what that chart is. You'll all get a copy of this so you can read it. I won't go through each one. But essentially, that's what that chart is about. All right? Safety first. The other thing I just want to point out is this. Again, OSHA has a website with all kinds of material on it for you, the employer. It's a lot. What kinds of gear you need in an emergency situation, how you need to run things. So all I'm going to say on this is there are requirements, changes based on your industry. Here's what a workplace emergency is, all right? And if you go online, OSHA.gov, and you look up disaster, you're going to find these kinds of things will be there. What is your emergency plan? What kind of a plan do you have for an emergency like that? So there's your action plan. It depends, you may or may not need one, but it can be a good idea to have one. How are you going to alert workers to the emergency? Who's going to call who? If a big storm comes in and you're going to close the office, who's responsible for notifying everybody in the work site? So that's what these things are about and what happens in an evacuation. So I'll direct you to OSHA.gov because we could talk for like 2 hours about that, but I'll just let you know that that's there. Okay? And you'll see everything I just talked about is what's in here. It's just a little bit more information. On this one though, keep in mind, maintain logs, preserve, tell workers where their records are. The recording requirement under OSHA doesn't apply if you have fewer than 10 employees. So this point wouldn't work for if you were a small employer. But if you're a large employer and you were dealing with OSHA issues or calling people to work during a natural disaster, you would have to deal with these reporting issues. Okay, leave. Any questions on that so far? Good. I know, you guys are like, this is so amazing, so interesting. I can't believe it. Okay, here's another thing that employees will do. So somebody, like everybody affected by Harvey. Now, I mentioned earlier the wage things. You can require people to take leave. You can say, well, if you want to clean your house out, I know you don't have a car to get to work anymore. because it got flooded. And the buses are working, but okay, use your accrued leave and you can stay out of work. Well, I don't have any more leave. Well, then maybe I'll let you go unpaid. Well, I have to feed my family, right? So sometimes companies will create these donate and share paid time off policies. And essentially that says, hey, you have accrued annual leave, you can give that to somebody else. So they may allow you, you may create something that allows them to donate that leave to a charity. They'll say, I'm not going to use, I won't take a vacation the rest of the year. I have 3 days of leave. So donate that 3 days of leave that you would have paid me and give it to Red Cross. And they'll use it for the cleanup effort. That's some things that companies have done, okay? Disaster relief, that's a special program that gives you tax benefits for doing it through that. If you do it this way, guess what? The employee's going to pay taxes, income tax, on the money they donate. Okay? But if you do it this way, there's certain breaks. And then standard leave, where they share it among their own employees. So I would have said to my colleague who was down in Houston, I could have said, I'm not going to use my leave this year. You use it to get your house back up in order. So these are ways that these are some of the things companies can do to help people in a tight spot. Family medical leave, who knows what that is? It's fresh. Good. The short answer is, this is the only one of the few laws that mandates leave, that guarantees protected leave. And essentially it says, if you have an employee who has a sickness of their own, or they have to take care of a family member, spouse, parent, child, who is sick, then they get mandatory 12 weeks of unpaid leave to do it. And you have to protect their job, you have to protect their benefits during that 12-week period. So that's basically what the law is. And down here, if they're a military man and they got injured at a work site, and in this case, if they went down to Houston and they got injured carrying somebody on their back and they pulled their back and now they're out of work for 26 weeks, you have to give it to that person to take care of a service member. Okay? So that's what the Family Medical Leave Act says. Here's the typical issues. You're going to get someone who says this, we had the disaster, I have no electricity, I lost all the medication for my mom's diabetes, I need time off to help her. Now, is that FMLA protected? Is it not FMLA protected? You could argue about it, but this is probably something that I would say, yeah, just to be cautious, maybe call it FMLA leave. I need to care for family members who are removed from a hospital, right? You had hospital nursing homes that were flooded. Suddenly now grandma's back at my house. I didn't have to take care of her until it happened in Houston, and now she's back in New Jersey, and now what am I going to do? So that's FMLA, okay? Emergency supplies, people run to the store, they're like, oh my gosh, a nor'easter's coming, and they run to Dwayne Reed and they scoop out all of the medicine and all of the Band-Aids, and they're like, you take care of your own stuff, and then they, go back to the house. So this could be a problem too. So now people need medication, and so now they're sick, and now they're asking for medical leave because they can't function without their regular medication. So these are, and then cleanup injuries. And interestingly, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, they said up 30 to 50% of all Katrina survivors suffered post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of going through that. So you may not see that until after the cleanup, when suddenly they start having panic attacks and anxiety, and it's PTSD from the natural disaster would be covered. Okay? At any rate, you're just going to want to be sure that what they're asking is in fact a qualifying leave under the FMLA before you give it to them. Okay? And that's where we are. I'll turn the time to Juan.
Okay, thank you, Trent. So we'll be talking about workplace violence, which is an issue that U.S. employers usually need to give special attention to. And I know that because we are having an event at China General Chamber of Commerce, so the attendees, most of you probably are from companies of like the U.S. subsidiaries or branches, offices of Chinese companies. And I grew up in China, so I know that it's not very common for us to talk about workplace violence, or to really pay special attention to it, because in China it's illegal to carry a gun, which becomes a huge issue now in the United States. So when we were talking about workplace violence in China, we probably would think, two colleagues like have physical fighting or just language violence. And though once in a while it may lead to like injury or serious injury, it's not as imminent or as serious as those situations in the United States. So that's why we want to talk about the workplace violence issue in the United States, to give you some idea of the legal requirements or related legal issues that we usually would encounter in the U.S. as compared to in China. And as you probably know, in United States, we have the highest per capita violence when compared to other countries in the world, worldwide. And nearly 2 million Americans report that they have been victims of workplace violence each year. So that is really a big number. And if we think about those cases that may not be reported to or announced by to the government, then that number may significantly increase as well. So what is workplace violence? This is kind of like a general definition of workplace violence. Any physical assault, threatening behavior, verbal abuse, or other conduct that is sufficiently severe, offensive, or intimidating to cause individuals to reasonably fear for their own safety or for the safety of their family, friends, and or property. So you see that workplace violence, the definition of workplace violence in the U.S. is much broader than what we would think when we work in China, or when we apply it to like workplace in some other countries. And I'll give some examples when we talk about it later. So I'll give you some examples of what would be normally or typically considered workplace violence in the United States. The workplace violence can be a crime, and this is probably the most typical example of workplace violence that we would immediately think of when we talk about this issue. So a criminal, so when the perpetrator has a legitimate relationship with the business or with the employees of the business, and they come to the workplace and they commit a crime on the property of the company, and that's considered like typical workplace violence. And other than that, workplace violence can also be caused by customers, employees, contractors, or clients of the company. So in those cases, the perpetrator has a legitimate relationship with the business and becomes violent while being served by the business. For example, a contractor, which is usually not an employee, considered an employee of the company, but they come to work on the property of the company as a temporary worker, and then they commit assault to other employees of the company, or to the clients, other clients or customers of the company that are on company property, and that's considered workplace violence as well. And it can also be caused by co-workers. And there is a special type that we do not really discuss at all in China, domestic violence. that can be converted or become workplace violence in certain situations. Because when we talk about domestic violence, we usually would think that it occurs at home, or at least it's out of workplace. However, when the perpetrator, who has no legitimate relationship with the business, but they have a personal relationship with the employees of the company, they may follow the employee to the workplace, and they may attack or cause some injury to the employee on company property, and in that case it becomes workplace violence instead of domestic violence. And actually, according to a recent report, 39% of the death on workplace, like death of female employees that happened or occurred on workplace, is caused by domestic violence. Caused by, for example, the spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, or relative of the employee. So that's really a huge number, and that we probably some foreign countries, companies from foreign countries, for example, China, we probably do not really alert it to, because that really doesn't happen very often in our own country. And since we were talking about domestic violence, I'll just give you some, a general summary of the legal issues related to domestic violence that we need to pay attention to. For example, state and city, New York State and New York City laws give some special protections to employees who are victims of domestic violence. So when an employee report to the employer, or some other employees who notice that a colleague may be a victim of domestic violence, they have the obligation to we would encourage them to report to the company, so that the company would comply with the obligations under state and city law. For example, they would grant them leave to attend court if necessary, or give them leave to seek medical treatment if they were subject to injury caused by domestic violence. And also, the company cannot retaliate those employees, the victims of the, domestic violence, if they want to take leave. They need to be out of work to seek medical treatment, or go to court, or just to seek shelter. So the company has the employers have the legal obligation to grant those accommodations. And as I said, employers would usually encourage employees to report domestic violence that they themselves were experiencing, or when they reasonably suspect that another employee was subject to domestic violence. And in certain situations, the employees are obligated to report to the company if the employee obtained a TRO, which is a temporary restricting order from the court, because the company needs to be aware of that in order to comply with the order. When an employee obtains that order and they immediately report to the company, then the company can, for example, inform the securities downstairs in the lobby to prohibit the person that it was listed in the order, TRO, to get into the company property. So, since workplace violence has so many, we have encountered so many issues with workplace violence, what should the employers do, or what are our recommendations to employers for preventing the workplace violence to occur? like usually the first suggestion that we would give to our clients is to ask them to prepare or seek help from their legal counsel to put together a zero tolerance workplace violence policy, which we do not usually see, when we are in China. So those policies can be included in the employee handbook and be distributed to the employee upon hire. And it can certainly be a standalone policy as well. But we need to distribute it to the employee and ask them to get familiar with it and to comply with the requirements in the policy. And in those policies, we would usually say that the company has zero tolerance of threats or acts of violence that involve or affect company employees or that occur on company's property, and also we will list the behaviors that are prohibited by the company in the policy, so that employees should be aware and comply with those requirements. And we should also specify that weapons are prohibited, but we should be careful here, because while all states would prohibit employees from bringing guns and weapons to their workplace, there are some states, including New York, that would allow employees to keep guns in a locked cars in their parking slot. So that's a kind of like exception, that employees, although they can't bring guns to their workplace, but they can keep it in the locked car in the parking slot, just in case anything happened when they get to the car, and they can protect themselves. And also in the policy, we're still talking about policy, we would encourage the employees to report immediately when they report to the HR or their legal department when they reasonably think that there is a risk of workplace violence. And we would sometimes put in the policy saying that you should call 911 if the danger or the risk is imminent, instead of going through that lengthy process of reporting. So we have talked about designated management response team. It can be, internally it can be legal team, legal department, in-house person, or the HR. And we can also designate like outside response team, for example, the local law enforcement, legal counsel, outside legal counsel, and create emergency response plan. We should put together a plan, list the steps that the employees should follow in those circumstances, and give trainings to managers and employees on how they should respond to, for example, an active shooter in the workplace. Someone just come in, as Trinh mentioned in last month, Las Vegas. If that happened, because
or in Walmart, they just had it in Walmart in Colorado this week.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So if that happened, and should employers, because due to the limited time today, we can't really spend a lot of time on that, but the active shooter training can be really a topic that we spend some time on, and to let you know the legal requirements, whether there's any legal requirements on that, and how we should get employees prepared if there's an active shooter in the workplace. Conduct background checks on prospective employees in accordance with law. Here we should pay attention to the requirements that background checks should be always conducted according to federal, state, and sometimes city law. For example, in New York, it is allowed for employers to conduct general background checks on prospective employees. However, you cannot ask employees about their criminal records or criminal history until after you give them a conditional offer. That means you have decided. The reason that the law has such a requirement is they do not want you to take into consideration of that employee's criminal history or criminal record when you make the decision on whether to hire that employee. So only after you have made your decision to hire that employee, then you can add a condition there saying that, you know, if you feel the criminal records background check or something, then we'll withdraw our offer. That's allowed. However, there are two exceptions. However, even though we have, you know, granted, issued the conditional offer letter to an employee, and we conducted the background check on their criminal history or records, and then we find out that the employee did commit a conviction previously, we cannot withdraw the offer if the nature of the crime or misdemeanor of the conviction is irrelevant to the requirements of the job. For example, for those financial institutions, banks, if you find out that someone through the background check, you granted the conditional offer and you find out that the candidate actually has a conviction that involves acts of dishonesty, and his job probably requires him to trade or sell securities. In those situations, the employers will have the right to withdraw the offer because his job is a requirement of his job to be an honest person, to avoid those financial fraud. So we can withdraw the offer. However, if he just have can give a good example now.
DUI, driving.
Oh, driving.
If he drives
yes.
drunk.
Yeah, drunk driving. You can say that because you had that record, then we'll withdraw your offer. And consider changing sign-in procedures to better account for employees. I want to mention this because I don't think a lot of companies have been considering this. And yesterday, actually, was talking with my other colleagues, and we were mentioning this because our office, we actually has a requirement for each attorney or employee staff to report to the front desk every day when they come in, and if they will leave for lunch break. This is not really only for the time records purposes, because as you may know, that the wage and hour law would always require that you have time clock or time records, accurate time records for employees, for non-exempt employees, because you need to rely on that to pay them according to their work hours. This is for the the purpose of counting which employees is in the office or has reported to work today, just in case any workplace violence occurred or natural disaster occurred. We would know that if we can find someone, or if the relative, a family member of that employee called in saying that during this disaster or incident, we can find my husband, my daughter, my son. Do you know whether he's actually in the office, whether he reported to the office? If we do not have that system, then there's no way we can count on each employee in those situations. And conduct safety audit, safe room. That's also uncommon in most companies. Usually you would have a room with very thick wall, and it's a very large room, and in those, like for example, active shooting situations, you can just quickly move your employees to that room, and the door is usually bulletproof, so that some people can stay safe there. Yeah, and the last point here, we have already mentioned that active shooter training, due to the time limit, we can't really expand on that, but you can feel free to ask any questions that you may have. So Trinh has covered some of the issues listed here, and I'll give the stage back to him and ask him to quickly go through some of the other issues here and then wrap up the program. Thank you.
Yeah, we hope that this gives you sort of a broad understanding of some of the safety issues that have come up and options that you can take. Now, we don't want to overly scare people either. Active workplace violence is still rare when you consider how many workers there are, right? So, although unfortunately there was a study done from 2000 to 2013, and there were about 1,000 incidents, 1,063 or something like that, incidents of workplace violence. No. There were 1,063 people that had been injured or killed in that period of time. About half and half. 480 people had been killed and 400-something had been injured through workplace violence. So fortunately, it is still a relatively rare thing, but the study also showed that the number of incidents, unfortunately, each year has continued to increase. So it is something that we need to be aware of. Now, I will say that, I'm still not dealing here with what I dealt with at Papua New Guinea mines a few months ago, where we had a bunch of people with machetes running around the mine, and that was a bit scary. So I guess we can say we still have a lot of safety. It's still safe here in a lot of ways, but we do want to be careful. As far as these go, we've talked about a lot of these things. The only last piece I'll put on is what's our policy on weapons? Keep in mind that all 50 states do allow concealed weapons permits. All 50 states. Some states allow open carry, means you can have the gun open. Many states do still, actually. But employers don't have to let them on the premises. So your property is private property. So you can have a guns policy that says we don't allow guns at the workplace, or you have to leave it in the parking lot. And there's some states that have rules about, they have to be allowed to leave it in their car or something like that. So you can prohibit weapons, but keep that in mind. And then your ADA and human rights issues, she already addressed when it comes to these things where we're dealing with people who have maybe a mental illness that causes them to react violently. Or domestic violence is also protected. So on the notice, you'll see that there was a lot of topics about labor and employment. We're happy to talk about any of them afterwards. If there's one that's of particular interest to you, leaves, human rights, discrimination, the cases, the risks that you think would be an interesting topic, please go ahead, and we're happy to come back anytime and address any of these other issues that are important to you as employers here. So thank you so much for your time. Do you have any questions? Otherwise, yeah, please, Nick.
Yeah, thanks. So those are very fascinating topics and super relevant to my line of work. So I just really have one question regarding the legal obligation from the employer for both scenarios, natural disaster and workplace safety.
Yeah.
Is there a difference in terms of obligations of employers treating towards locally hired, like local employees versus locally hired foreigners, for example, Chinese employees, or even short-term business travelers coming here?
So the answer to your first question is no, and second one is yes. So what I mean is, if an individual is an expat, a Chinese expat, and they're here for a 3 to 5 year term, okay, most of the time, the U.S. laws are going to apply to them as well. Now, what often happens is you're going to keep your Chinese contract, and it's going to give you Chinese-style benefits and leave, and they may say you still stay on the leave options, your leave policy under the Chinese company. So they can still enforce that. And it gets harder when it comes to an FMLA right. So if your employees come to you and they're an expat employee, and they come to you and say, I need 12 weeks off to take care of my wife who's sick, but the Chinese expat contract doesn't provide 12 weeks off for a sick wife, then it's a real factual determination. How long has he been there? Do we think that the U.S. law applies? What does the contract say? Probably, in most cases, if they're on a long-term assignment, we'd probably still advise to give it to them. On the other hand, business visitors, travelers, no. So if you're here for 3 months, if you're here for 6 months, you're in and out of the country, and you're still on the Chinese contract, and they come to you on their, second month here, and they're like, hey, I heard about this FMLA thing. And you're gonna say, yeah, it doesn't apply to you. So it's a terrific question. Okay. Anything else? We're here for the next few minutes if you want to talk after, but otherwise, thanks for your time. Thank you, Nick, for the question.